Here is our very first study of the evening. We're actually seeing something. NGC 6334 is a nebulosity in Scorpius. You can see the nebulosity right up there on the screen. Maybe we captured it before, maybe not, but it's pretty close to culminating now. 120 by 110 arc-minute size, emissive nebula, 5,700 light years distant. Probably the southernmost study and the westernmost. Right ascension 172049, declination -360612. I am glad we came back to revisit this one. It looks suggestive of the Crescent Nebula, much further north in Cygnus. Here we have another nebula, NGC 6357 in Scorpius. We started here earlier in the evening. We may have gotten a blank screen, but that's not the case now. 50 by 40 arc-minute size emissive. We're obviously only seeing the brightest central region there. 3,900 light years distant. Right ascension 172443, declination -341206. I am glad we've come back to revisit a few of these earlier studies that we missed because they were too far to the east and they had yet to culminate. So we're going to go on and see if we can get another one picked out, 6383. Well, we are now getting a very decent view. We've exited Scorpius for the time being. We're now in Sagittarius for NGC 6445, a planetary nebula, magnitude 13, 35 by 30 arc-seconds in size. Central star is a magnitude 19. The planetary is located 4,500 light years distant, has a right ascension of 17 hours, 49 minutes, and 15 seconds, and yahoo, a declination of -20 degrees, 36 seconds. There is a very interesting view of an extremely irregular looking planetary, but I would say we're probably seeing this one in profile rather than seeing it along the axis of the poles, which probably explains its rather unusual presentation. Very nice view. Here we have a nebula and open cluster that needs little introduction in Sagittarius. NGC 6514 is also Messier 20, magnitude 6.3, 28 arc-minutes in size with some 67 stars. The brightest star is magnitude 6, which you can see right at the middle of the Trifid Nebula. It's an emissive type nebulosity, 2,700 light years distant, right ascension 180242, and declination -225818. A very nice look with plenty of interesting texture and color distribution, from a kind of a pinkish purple to a faint blue. And that blue is pervasive in various degrees of intensity all over the screen. NGC 6520 is a nice tight open cluster in Sagittarius. Magnitude 7.6, 6 arc-minutes in size, 60 stars, the brightest of which are magnitude 9. It is a class 1-2, 5,300 light years distant. That's Roman numeral 1, which means it's fairly compact, and the stars as a 2 are roughly of a similar magnitude, but not quite. Right ascension 180324 and declination -275318. And I remind folks that we are tracking down studies this evening at the deep south of the Milky Way that are within 5 or so degrees of the galactic mid-plane. So that is the theme of this night's studies. Interesting. Here's another view of the Lagoon Nebula, but however this is NGC 6533 and captures both the nebula and the open cluster in Sagittarius. This is adventitious. 90 by 40 arc-minute emissive, 4,300 light years distant, right ascension 180406, -24:23 minutes and 0 seconds. It also lies within the bounds of our parameters for this evening near the galactic plane. But it gives us a good view of the nebulosity and the cluster all at once. Here we have NGC 6553, a nice globular cluster in Sagittarius. Watch it develop on the screen. Magnitude 8.3, smallest 3.2 arc minutes, brightest stars, magnitude 15.3. It's a class 11, so fairly spread out. 15,000 light years distant. Right ascension 1809.17, declination minus 2554.30. And as I look at my next one, I'll see if we can get a little more resolution on this one. Let's make our next hop on an adventitious study. It looks like things have sharpened up reasonably well up there. Well, what we have here is a very nice sprinkling of faint stars as an open cluster in Sagittarius, NGC 6603, faintish, magnitude 11.5, a mere 5 arc minutes in size, some 100 stars, so fairly robust cluster. 11,700 light years distant. The brightest stars are magnitude 14. This is a class Roman numeral 1 and numeric 1 cluster, which means basically the stars are of similar luminosity and they're fairly compactly presented. Very sweet looking open cluster. We're at right ascension 18:18:26 and declination minus 18:24:24. Okay, here we have NGC 6611. Should be recognizable. It's a nebula and open cluster in Serpens. Has another designation, Messier 16. Magnitude 6, about 7 arc minutes in size. There are some 60 stars in the cluster. Brightest are of magnitude 11. It's a class 2-3, 5,800 light years distant. And I think you can make out what the common name for this cluster is. And the way I usually determine that is because of this very bird-like feature here with the wings outspread and its claws, talons forward. So otherwise what we're looking at is the Eagle Nebula. Right ascension 18:18:48, declination minus 13:48:24, nicely centered on the screen. Brightish nebulosity. It's not specifying whether it's emissive or not. I suspect it is. It's at the blue end of the spectrum. And it's instead of white, but that could be just coloration on the screen, juxtaposed against a nice open cluster of brightish stars. NGC 6611. Another easily recognized study from the Messier catalog, Messier 17, described as a nebula and open cluster in Sagittarius with the New General Catalog entry of 6618. The nebula and cluster is magnitude 6, some 11 arc minutes in size, and some 40 stars, brightest of which are magnitude 9.3. It's a class 3-3, so the stars are spread out of disparate magnitudes, 4,200 light years distant. Right ascension 18:20:47. Declination minus 16:10:18, and I keep in mind as we view this that we've now seen a couple of very nice nebulosities, the Eagle and the Swan, and they're right along the spine of the midline of the galactic core and region extending out in the directions, so we're on the median of the Milky Way galaxy, which is, of course, the main thrust of our studies last night, tonight, and potentially again next evening. if we get decent seeing conditions. Okay, what we're seeing here is NGC 6705, an open cluster in Scutum, and you can tell that this is also a Messier study. Number 11, magnitude 5.8, 14 arc minutes in size, some 500 stars are present. That's a very large number for an open cluster, rivaling the Pleiades, which are much, much closer. This cluster is 6,100 light years distance. Its brightest star is magnitude 8, and it is a class Roman numeral 1, 2, which means 1, Roman numeral 1, very condensed, 2, stellar magnitudes are fairly consistent. It's at right ascension 185105 and declination -6, 1612, and this is a very fine cluster. Has so many stars that it'll probably last quite a while, even though it's in the direction of the galactic core along the mid-plane of the galaxy. It probably will resist being picked apart for several, probably hundreds of millions of years by gravitational tidal forces. Predictably, we've dropped down into Scutum once again, and probably below the celestial equator for this fine globular cluster, NGC 6712, the first of the evening in Scutum, as mentioned, magnitude 8.2, 4.3 arc minutes in size. The brightest stars are magnitude 13.3. It's a class 9, which means the stars are fairly spaced out. 22,000 light years distant puts it into the M13 range and M92. The right ascension is 1853.04 and declination is -842.19. Always love to see globular clusters. Again, this one in particular, against a rich background of Milky Way stars as it lies right along the meridian of our Milky Way galaxy, the balancing point between its northern and southern hemispheres. No open cluster here. We are seeing something that looks a little like a luminous Christmas tree, doesn't it? NGC 6760, globular cluster in Aquila, magnitude 9.1, 2.4 arc minutes in size. The brightest stars are magnitude 15.6. It's a class 9 of 12. Although it looks pretty condensed, that may just be the core. 24,000 light years distant. Right ascension 191111, declination 1 degree, 1 minute and 49 seconds. That's a pretty nice view, very distinct against the background of well-populated stars along the axis of the Milky Way, longitudinal axis of the Milky Way galaxy. Oh boy, you gotta love NGC 6781. Very expansive planetary nebula in Aquila. Overall brightness is magnitude 11.8, but very large, 111 by 109 arc seconds. The central star should be visible, although it may be clouded out a little bit, at magnitude 16.9. This planetary nebula is almost as large as, is about as large as the ring, but is 2,300 light years distant, so roughly maybe a little further out than the ring nebula. Right ascension is 19/18/28 and declination is 6/32/19. I'm going to leave this sweetie up on the screen as I search out the next study along the spine of the Milky Way. Just about to launch to NGC 6800. Swinging south again, but still remaining in Vulpecula the Fox, is NGC 6802 open cluster, magnitude 8.8, smallest 3.2 arc minutes with 50 stars, brightest of which are magnitude 12.9. What a beautiful sprinkling of stars that is. It's class 3-1, 3,700 light years distant. Right ascension 1930-35, declination 20-15-42. And that is a very sweet view with a very strong sense of length to this cluster, but very nice. Okay, a planetary nebula that is quite distinct as such. NGC 6804 Planetary in Aquila, magnitude 12.4, largish, over a minute, 63 arcseconds by 50. Central star at magnitude 14.2, 5,600 light years distant. We're at right ascension 1931-35, declination +9, 13-31. And I'm going to let you hold that view while I go and search out our next study along the spine of the Milky Way. Our next study isn't on my list. It may not actually be within 5 degrees of the spine, but I suspect it is. But the reason I want to call it up is because it's a galaxy. Wow, we're looking all the way through the Milky Way at NGC 6814, galaxy in Aquila. Brightish, magnitude 11.2, and largest 3.5 by 3.5 arc minutes. Spiral with a bar in lowercase bc, which puts it 2.5 times removed from lenticular. This galaxy also displays a ring. Ordinarily, we might expect to see it. At magnitude 11.2, the ring should be somewhere around magnitude 15. This galaxy is 70 million light years distant, located at right ascension 1942-40 and declination -10, 1926. Because of that far southern declination, I suspect it's probably more than 5 degrees away from the spine, the meridian of the Milky Way galaxy, but it is worth having a view anyway. So enjoy. I will continue this as I press, oh yeah, NGC 6815, I believe, is the study that we do want to capture along the meridian of the Milky Way. We've now entered into the beak of Cygnus the Swan for NGC 6834. Cygnus does fly to the south, so it must be winter time, although it is actually currently summer. 6834 is an open cluster in Cygnus, magnitude 7.8. Tight though, 5 arc minutes in size, so about a third of the screen on the vertical axis. Some 50 stars, the brightest of which are 9.6 magnitude. It's a class 2-2, 6,700 light years distant, right ascension 1952-12, declination almost 30 degrees, plus 29, 24, 30. We have come quite a ways since we started out at about -10 or 15 degrees in declination early in this evening's series of NGCs along the spine of the Milky Way. NGC 6842 is a planetary nebula in Vulpecula. No, it is not the dumbbell planetary, because this one is magnitude 13.1, although it's largest, 53 by 48. Oh yes, it's a beauty. I can see it right in the middle of the screen. Arc seconds in size. Brightest central star is magnitude 14.5. It's located about 4,500 light years distant, so about twice the distance of the Ring Nebula. Its right ascension is 1955-02 and declination is plus 29-17-20. I just love it when those planetaries actually show us something of their annular or dumbbell natures. Very nice view. I'll leave it up on the screen as I search out what is likely to be our final study, unless I come across something that, like a galaxy, which is incidental. So, okay, one final planetary nebula for the evening, and this one is along the spine of the Milky Way, and let's go have a look at it. You, of course, know this planetary nebula as Messier 27, also known as the Dumbbell. But it has another name that was entered by Dreyer in the New General Catalog of the 1890s, NGC 6853, Planetary Nebula in Vulpecula, magnitude 7.3, large, 480 by 340 arcseconds, with a central star of magnitude 14.1, standing there right in the middle for all to see. This planetary is 860 light years distant, which accounts for its size because it's about half to a third the distance of the Ring Nebula. Its right ascension is 1959-36, declination 22-43-15. Here's our now centered version of NGC 60. It's not showing on the screen after I centered it. 6857. It's now centered in the screen, and the mount's been synchronized. There's our look, and we shall move on. Shades of Ring Nebula here for NGC 6894. Planetary in Cygnus, faint though, magnitude 14.4 but largish, 44 by 39 arcseconds, creating a nice ghostly presence on the screen. The central star is magnitude 18.3, kind of beyond the limits of the scope at current settings. Meanwhile, the nebulosity towards the center of that planetary would probably obscure it anyway. 5,400 light years distant. The right ascension 2016-23, declination 30-33-54. NGC 6894. Here we have NGC 7008, Planetary Nebula in Cygnus, magnitude 12, largish, 86 by 69 arcseconds, but a bright central star, relatively, of magnitude 13.9. The planetary is located 2,800 light years away. Right ascension 21 hours 32 seconds, and declination plus 54, 32, 34, which is about as far north as I think we can get tonight. I think we are getting some minor amount of obstruction. And I would ask you what kind of light would be put out by a planetary nebula, whether it's reflective or emissive in nature. There is actually a very nice view of that planetary nebula there, which I presume we're looking at in profile. So it's looking more like a dumbbell than it is like a ring. It's got some pretty color to it too, and the central star is quite present as well. NGC 7044 is an open cluster, once again in Cygnus, magnitude 12, so very faint. I can basically see it as a faint cloud on the screen with some resolved star components. Magnitude 12, 6 arc minutes in size. The brightest stars are of magnitude 15, which basically, well, they're pretty present up there on the screen. That's actually quite a sweetie there, isn't it? 10,000, it's a class 2-2, 10,300 light years distant, no wonder. Right ascension is 21-1309, declination is 42-29-46. Very pleasing cluster to look at. And I'm very happy that we captured it this evening. What we're seeing in NG 7048 is another very sweet planetary nebula in Cygnus. Magnitude 11, 60 by 50 arc seconds in size. Wow, that's very nice. Central star of magnitude 18, look for it, but I don't think you'll see it. 5,300 light years distant. The right ascension is 211415. We have progressed by about an hour. I do believe we started at right ascension 20 hours. So we've covered some 15 degrees heading eastward at this point to follow the midline of the Milky Way galaxy to the north and the east towards Cassiopeia, where it will peak and then start descending once it gets to the south. Our declination is 46 degrees 17 minutes and 17 seconds. That's a sweet view of a planetary nebula. NGC 7048, glad we met you. What we have here is another one of those really tight, small, open clusters in Cygnus. Its magnitude is 8.3, 7 arc minutes in size, some 30 stars, the brightest of which are magnitude 10.1. It's a Roman numeral 3-1, so remember, I'm not sure which is applied to which, but one of the numbers, probably the Roman numeral, has to do with the amount of magnitudinal variation in the cluster. And the other has to do with how dispersed the stars are. Stars look pretty tight. Well, anyway, I'll leave it up to you. Class 3-1, and looking at that cluster, it looks like many of the stars are of a similar magnitude, but it's peppered with fainter stars as well. 7 arc minutes, fairly well condensed, so I'm not quite sure what they intended to say when they came up with the classification for this particular cluster of Roman numeral 3, numeric 1. NGC 7209 is in that forgotten constellation along the Milky Way, Lacerta the Lizard. It's an open cluster of magnitude 7.7, 25 arc minutes in size, filling the screen. 25 stars, the brightest of which is magnitude 9. It is a class 3-1, 3,800 light years distant. Right ascension 220507. Declination 4629.0. What we have here is IC 5076. Now, I can't really claim that I see it, and nor may you see it, but it's supposed to be a nebula in Cygnus of the reflection type with a size of 9 by 7 arc minutes. Right ascension 205533, and in the right declination realm as well, 472342. I'll let this develop a little bit. There's one really bright star, though, on the field. Here, of course, we are seeing the Crescent Nebula, NGC 6888 in Cygnus, magnitude 10, 20 by 10 arc minutes, emissive type, 4,800 light years distant. Right ascension 2012-06, declination 38-21-17. And as you recall, we started the evening with a right ascension of roughly around 20 hours, and we began our explorations at roughly around 30 degrees north declination. And finally, we have arrived at what I consider one of the best 128.42 shutter speed and decibel sensitivity views I've had in the Crescent Nebula. And the reason is it's getting very close to culminating at this time. Let me tell you what time it is. It is now 11:19, so it's roughly an hour after I started, and we have covered some 30 to 35 different studies in the sky, most of which have been New General Catalog, compiled in the 1880s and 90s by J.L.E. Dreyer, and it was later added into the catalog as the index catalog by Dreyer in the early 1900s. The NGC catalog, I would recommend all amateur astronomers begin with the Messier list. You should be able to find them all, many of them through binoculars, but you should be able to see them all through a 3 or 4 inch scope, preferably a refractor. if you could get one, or a 6-inch reflector would be nice. And then move on to the NGC catalog. Now I do recall through my 6-inch Maxitov Cassegrain being able to make out some of the luminosity of the Crescent Nebula, but never the entire sweep of the nebula as we are seeing here. So that's a very fine view. If you're challenged by lots of lights in your locale, incidental light plays havoc on the retina and being able to make out. It's also very frustrating to amateur astronomers. Then you can do what I've done here at John Day, equip yourself with a backyard observatory. Basically how to make one is on this site as part of the astronomy thread. Populate it with a nice go-to scope or a push-to if you wish, and then you'll be able to get out just about any night. You'll have no excuses to get out on a very beautiful night such as tonight and put your gather those photons, even if you have to look on a screen. And the beauty of looking on a screen is that you don't have to worry about dark adaptation, and you can share the views with others. Carpe Noctem.